In a previous edition of a 2-minute guide, I talked about the steps in doing an analysis, the 4 steps: summarize the scene and the main idea, talk about the argument. Then the second step is identify the main technique, give an example of that technique, explain the effect, and finally offer an interpretation. In this edition of the 2-minute guide, I'm going to give you an example of how this works and take you through the steps, and so you can see what this looks like in an essay. Now, this is not an entire essay, a whole essay. This is a part of an essay, but it is an analysis. It's a good analysis. So, Act 1, Scene 7 of Macbeth is a good example of how applying a particular set of ideas can lead to a very different interpretation of meaning in the play. This sentence identifies the argument, and the argument is that applying different ideas changes meaning. Although the reason for Duncan's murder is quickly given by Macbeth, vaulting ambition, a psychoanalytic reading of this scene reveals a subconscious desire by the scheming couple to deal with the recent loss of their child. Now, this is the main idea. So the main idea is that something motivates there is a subconscious motivation for killing Duncan, and of course the overall argument is that meaning can change depending on context, ideological context. Now, you've done that, so that's the first step. This is a summary. Notice how I'm not saying what happens in Act 1, Scene 7. It's implied that they're talking about the murder, that's integrated into the summary, but there is no step-by-step outline of what happens in this scene. That's not appropriate. The second step, if you remember, was to show a language technique, name a language technique, give examples of that language technique, and then talk about or write about the effect. So, seemingly far-fetched, this interpretation of the scene is supported by the repeated references and allusions to children. So, repeated references and allusions to children. There's a technique. The technique is allusion. In Newborn Babe, Cherubim, Given Suck, and Adage. These are the examples. This is the evidence of these allusions. Now I have to write about the effect. This reinforces the psychoanalytic reading of this scene by suggesting that a child is somehow involved in Macbeth's decision to murder Duncan. There is the effect. This is what this technique leads to. That's the conclusion I have reached based on these techniques. Similarly, I'm doing the same thing again. Lady Macbeth's reference to breastfeeding in Given Suck, and Macbeth's subsequent desire to kill Fleance, who would one day, according to the witches, become king. The implication is that Macbeth does not have an heir, emphasizes the central role of an absent child in Macbeth's decision to kill Duncan. So that's all part of the effect of this reference to children. Next paragraph, you'll notice I'll do exactly the same thing, except I will reinforce my argument by providing more evidence. So, also the ambiguous imagery of horses. There you go. Ambiguity, imagery, there's the technique. And horseback riding further contributes to this psychoanalytic reading of Macbeth. Symbolic of both strength and royalty, Macbeth continuously evokes the image through trammel, spur, and leap. Here is the evidence of the imagery of horses and horseback riding. And this suggests, and there's the effect, a subconscious desire to regain control or to trammel over life and death through Duncan's murder. There is the effect of this imagery. It's an interpretation. You may not agree with this interpretation, but it is an interpretation nevertheless, and it's a good analytical paragraph. Similarly, the metaphor, there goes, another technique. Golden opinions, the technique, the metaphor is actually given, evokes a subconscious and paradoxical desire for both permanence and renewal, alluding to an inner psychological conflict. Again, there is the explanation, the effect of this metaphor, and the technique is named. Finally, Macbeth's decisive exclamation, "Bring forth men, children only," reinforces the idea of a deeper, darker motivation behind his subsequent murder of Duncan, and this contributes to the effect. So, To wrap things up, we need an interpretation, and this needs to link to the overall argument. And the argument here, remember, is that texts change meaning depending on which ideas you apply. And it needs to link to that. So the interpretation is not about Act 1, Scene 7, it's about the nature of meaning. So while meaning can be influenced by changing values and contexts, applying ideas relevant to Freudian psychoanalysis emphasizes the instability of meaning and the variety of possible readings of any text, including Macbeth. And this is an interpretation. It's a conclusion reached on the evidence that I have provided here. So you can see how those 4 steps, taken one step at a time, can actually lead to a fairly decent analytical series of paragraphs that can then be part of a wider argument in an essay.